Welcome to Module 11 of the Tribal Data Toolbox training, and in this module we are going to go over how to generate AQS formatted files from the toolbox. So remember, in the previous module what we did was get the toolbox ready to generate these AQS formatted files. So just so you know, there are two types of AQS formatted files that can be generated with the toolbox. So the first type are the raw data files, and in AQS lingo this is called an RD file, and that includes the hourly plume or your map parameter values that you collect. The second type of AQS formatted files are the QA/QC checks that you do, and in AQS lingo these are called QA files, and your QA files can include the results of your flow rate verifications if you're talking about PM data, or if you're talking about your gaseous pollutant data, that's the known versus measured checks. So after you generate these AQS format files with the toolbox, you still need to complete the process of submitting these files to AQS. You need to log into AQS and then send the files on their happy way. So from within the toolbox, to generate AQS files, we are going to start with the continuous or meteorological data fast track. And we use this button here that says AQS data file creation. So we click on that and we will see a new form, and here's how the form looks. So the way this form works is you want to select your options here on the left hand side and then move on to this right hand side of the form. I am going to start with my ozone data. You have to go from left to right and then from top to bottom. So you go across and then down, just like you're reading a book. So I need to start with my AQS site ID, and for my ozone monitor that's 0025, and my sampler ID is IN03, and my POC is 1. And now my parameters, I've got several different parameters here because my ozone monitor at this site, and I also have my meteorological monitor at this site. And remember, these are the codes that we assigned in the previous module. So all that work we did in the previous module is carried over here. So I'm going to start with the ozone. And the method code, we only entered one method code for ozone, right? So there's only one method here. So in all of the remaining boxes, there's only one option since we only entered one monitor protocol record for our ozone monitor. So the units, parts per million, which is what we want because that's what we entered, and the sample duration is 1 hour. So we made all the selections we need to make on the left-hand side of the form, and we're going to move on to the right-hand side of the form, which is starting up here. So the next thing we need to do is enter the range of the dates we want in our AQS submission file. So I've only imported 2 weeks of data for my ozone sampler into the toolbox. So I only have a date range of August 8th, 2013 through August 22nd, 2013. And just remember, you can submit data to AQS on any schedule you want. So you can do a weekly submission, you can do a monthly submission, but most people do a quarterly submission. So if you were to do quarterly submissions, you would, for the third quarter, you would enter a date range of July 1st, 2013 through September 30th, 2013. So I'm just going to do my biweekly data, which was 8/8/2013 through 8/22/2013. And the next button that's on the form is the add zero value continuous pollutant records to AQS RD file for data gaps in this range. What this button does is allows the toolbox to gap fill for missing date time values in the date range you selected. This is completely optional, but one of the advantages of doing this is that you are then reporting to AQS that you did have an active monitoring program during these missing hours, but for some reason the data are missing. So for example, your data logger had a power outage and it did not log that it was running during that period. So if you elect to use this ability, the toolbox temporarily adds zero value records with an AQS null value code of AF. And AF means schedule but not collect in AQS. And then when you close the Toolbox AQS form, the toolbox automatically removes the zero value records as added. It's not ever going to remove anything that you've added to the toolbox, only the things that it adds. So it will just remove those zero values that it added. This is somewhat similar to what we saw on the Toolbox Continuous Method Reports and Charts form. But there is an important difference that I'm going to demonstrate. So remember that when I use this option from the Continuous Methods Reports and Charts form, the Toolbox did not find any gaps in my ozone data. So let's try it and see if it finds gaps here. Okay, so what's going on here? So why is it telling me that there's 24 pollutant records missing from the date range selected when it didn't said there was none missing when I did this button from the Continuous Methods and Report Chart? So the answer is that since you are submitting data to AQS from this form, the Toolbox assumes you have completed importing data for the start and end dates in the range you specified. So remember, my data set started at 8/8/2013, and it started at 8 a.m. and then it ended at 8/22/2013 at 7 a.m. So what the Toolbox does is counts the hours of 12 a.m. to 7 a.m. on 8/8/2013, as well as the hours of 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. on 8/22/2013 as missing. So that's where it's getting that total of 24 hours of missing data. So that data is not really missing because I still have more data to import into the Toolbox for August of 2013. So I do not want to use the gap filling method on this form, so I'm going to click cancel on that. If you want to use the gap filling option from the Toolbox from the AQS form, you need to make sure you have imported a complete day's worth of data for the starts and end times in the range you enter. So for example, if you wanted to submit data to AQS on a bi-weekly basis and your imports do not start at midnight on the first date or end at 11 p.m. on the last date, you would need to wait until after the next import into the Toolbox to generate the AQS data files for the first import, because then you would have the complete set. So if you choose to use the gap filling option. So I'm going to go ahead and click cancel because I do not want to gap fill at this point. So we'll do that. And the AQS format type option here. So the Toolbox can output your AQS-Ready files in the type delimited format or the XML format. The default value for the box is type delimited. And you can choose XML from the drop-down box for your RD files, your raw data files, but you cannot choose XML for the quality assurance data, your QA files. It can generate type delimited for both of these. And I'm going to go on to the next step here. And the next step is the option of specifying AQS flags. Something important to note here is that AQS flags are the AQS exceptional events, the quality assurance, or informational flags. They are not, I repeat, not AQS null value code. In the Toolbox, you can only assign AQS null value codes in the final data validation step that we went over in Module 8. So assigning an AQS flag does not invalidate the data or prevent the data from appearing in the Toolbox reports. Adding an AQS flag only flags the data, but the value is still included in the AQS format to file. So remember that the internal Toolbox flags that you assigned during the initial data review when you imported your data into the Toolbox are not shown in the AQS formatted files. And maybe this is something you want to do, so you want to add AQS flags to the Toolbox flag data you have not invalidated. That might be a time that you want to use AQS flags. So remember, they're completely optional. And for my ozone data, I do not have any values that I want to add an AQS flag to. So I'm not going to complete that step, and I'm going to move on and go into the raw data inspect data step. All of the steps for generating a raw data file are enclosed by this green frame here. So once I've told the Toolbox what kind of raw data I want, so I want ozone data, and I want the data for this range, I can generate that file with the Toolbox. So the first button allows me to inspect the data, so I'm going to click on that. And this is the report you get when you click on that button for your pollutant data. So besides making sure that this is the data that I intended to select, this is also an opportunity to make sure I assign the AQS null value codes and AQS flags that I wanted to assign. So you'll see right here that I assigned an AQS null value code and my concentration is nulled out. And that's also how it's going to appear in the AQS formatted file. This is not an AQS formatted file. This is just an inspection of the data before the AQS formats file is generated by the toolbox. Also, I wanted to note that there's 2 checks that the toolbox performs here, and those checks are represented by the red and the orange headers. And if you see a value other than 0 in this box here that says number of concentrations exceeding EPA sampler data guidelines without AQS null value codes, then that means that the toolbox has found concentrations that are either below the EPA absolute minimum or they're above the EPA absolute maximum for the sampler. And remember that you can research what the EPA absolute minimum is and the EPA absolute maximum is, and we have a link to research that in our notes document. And this is telling you, okay, you've not assigned an AQS null value code to these really small or really large concentration values, and those are going to go into your AQS formatted file that the toolbox generates unless you take further actions. So if you have these values, we recommend that you invalidate them, because if they're above the absolute maximum or below the absolute minimum, those are really large or really small values, and they're more than likely something's wrong with your sampler. So that's something you should have caught in the final data validation step, but everyone's human and perhaps you need it, but we can catch it now and invalidate that data by going back to the final data validation step of the toolbox. So I don't have any in my particular data set. If you had them, they would show up as a warning. You would see a warning for each of the rows that had that. And the next check it does is the number of concentrations exceeding 3 standard deviations from average with the AQS null value codes header. So that means that the toolbox has found concentration values that are more than 3 standard deviations from the average concentration for that sampler. So what the toolbox does is it calculates an average and a standard deviation that are specific to your data. So it goes through and it checks your data and says, wow, this value was above 3 standard deviations from the average. And it gives you a warning. And you would find those here as well, but they would be in orange. And these are not as important to invalidate. And in fact, you might not want to invalidate them if the toolbox is just telling you that they're there. So notice this is in red. So this kind of goes like a stoplight, meaning red, stop. So if you saw red in here, you probably want to stop and go back to the final data validation step. So I don't have either of those that pertain to my data, because I have zeros in both ways. So I'm going to continue reviewing my data by scrolling through this report. So I just scroll. I remember that I also invalidated. So these were the other 2 that I invalidated, and you'll notice also that they are nulled. And then at the very bottom, there is an option to view the data in spreadsheet format if you want to look at your data in a query rather than a report format. So I'm okay with viewing the data in report format, so I'm not going to click on that button. If you want to, you could do that. And then if you do that, you have the option, as with any query in Microsoft Access, of exporting the data into a spreadsheet if you want to do that. If you need help with that, please let your instructors know. Everything looks good to me, so I am going to scroll back up here and close my report and go on to the next step in the toolbox. So the next step you can see here is create AQS-Ready file. So what that does is it makes the raw data file that's an AQS-Ready file. So I am going to click on that. So it tells me that the AQS pipe delimited file, and it gives the name of the file, AQS_RD.txt, has been generated and can be found in the Tribal Data Toolbox version 3.0 folder. So I say okay, and now I have the option of viewing that data file. So let's take a look at how it looks. And here it is in all its beauty. So notice, remember I invalidated that first row, and notice that there is not a concentration value there, and that's what I want. And there is an AQS null value code instead. So this is how my beautiful file looks. There's the other 2 that were invalidated, and it looks gorgeous to me. One thing to point out here is that every time you generate a pipe delimited AQS-RD file with the toolbox, it's named the same thing. So this is always going to be named AQS-Ready.txt, and it also goes into the same folder every time. So what does that mean? That means that every time I generate one of these files with the toolbox, it's going to copy over the other file that I generated previously. So in order to save this file, I need to rename it and move it to a different folder. Otherwise, the toolbox is going to overwrite it every time. So I am going to do that. So I'll click on File, Save As, so I can move it to a different folder. So I do File, Save As, and now I can save it into a different folder. And I've made a folder that's on my desktop for saving my AQS files that are ready to submit to AQS. So I'm going to navigate to that folder, and it's this one that says Into AQS. And now I'm going to rename my file, and it's important to type something in descriptive since you are going to have many files saved into this folder. And I recommend the naming convention of parameter underscore AQS.ID underscore AQS file type underscore date range. So I'm going to demonstrate that. So my parameter was ozone, so I enter ozone and then an underscore. And my site ID, my AQS site ID is 0025. And this is a raw data file. That's my AQS file type. And my date range was 8/8/13 through 8/22/13. So I enter 08/08/13 through 08/22/13. And then I click on the Save button. And now that file has been safely moved to my AQS folder, and I can close the file. So that completes the generation of the raw data file for my ozone sampler. And now I need to generate my ozone QA file that consists of the known versus measured checks. So the buttons pertaining to the QA file are right here, and they're enclosed by this green frame under the quality assurance data header. So first, I need to tell the toolbox what types of checks to include in the file by selecting the type of assessment from the drop-down box. So the type of assessments listed here are either a 1-point quality control or the annual performance evaluation. And remember that you've seen these selections way back on the QC data entry form when you entered your QC data into the toolbox. So these are the same selections. So I've only entered 1-point QC checks. That's the routine biweekly checks performed with my equipment for this sampler. So I'm going to make that selection. If you had both a 1-point QC check and the annual performance evaluation for this particular date range, you'd have to complete these steps twice. So you'd have to first go through these steps for the 1-point QC and then complete these steps again for the annual performance evaluation. So the first thing I get to do is preview the data that are going to be included in the QA file by clicking on the Inspect Data button. And this comes up. This box tells me how to include co-located data as precision data in AQS. I don't have a co-located sampler, but I read through this message box and say, okay, I understand that. Always a good idea to read through these message boxes, even if you've seen them a million times before. I click OK, and this shows my data. So as opposed to the report for your continuous pollutant data, this is shown in spreadsheet format. So notice we have an actual value and an indicated value, and that was the values we entered into the check 1 boxes. Remember that for your 1-point quality control check, the toolbox only reports in your AQS formatted file the checks you entered into the check 1 boxes of the Toolbox QC form. So these data look good to me, and that's what I want to include in my AQS formatted file. So I am going to close this query by clicking on the X in the upper right corner of this query and continue with the AQS QA file generation process on the Toolbox form. So the next step here is to create the AQS QA file button. So I will do that, and it tells me that the pipe delimited AQS QA.txt file has been generated and can be found in the Tribal Data Toolbox version 3.0 folder on your hard drive. So I say OK, and then let's take a look at it. View AQS QA file, and here it is. again, that's another beautiful type delimited AQS formatted file. And as with my RD files, every time I generate a QA file with the toolbox, it's named exactly AQS_QA.txt, and it's saved in your Tribal Data Toolbox version 3.0 folder. So what that means, again, is that every time you generate one of these, the toolbox is going to overwrite your previous one. So you want to save it somewhere else. So I'm going to do File Save As, and I'm going to go into my desktop, which is where my folder is for these AQS files. And then I'm going to go into AQS, and you'll see here's my ozone one for my RD file that I just generated. Now I'm going to generate my QA file, and I'm going to use the same naming convention. So I will enter ozone, and then underscore 0025. But this time it's not an RD file, it's a QA file. And now I will enter my date range. And this makes it really easy to find your files if you follow a good naming convention. And let's just double check that I entered that correctly. That looks good, so I click save. And now that file has been safely moved to my AQS folder. So I will close that, and that completes the process of generating my AQS QA files and my AQS RD file for the ozone data that I have imported and entered into the toolbox. So next, I'm going to work on generating my PM 2.5 data files.